Well, welcome everybody. Thank you. What an incredible turnout, and I think it's because we've got really an incredible panel today. We're going to get into it quickly. I'll introduce our panelists very quickly. We'll go for about 35 minutes of some questions that I'll ask and get some discussion going, but then we'll open it up in traditional Aspen format for Q&A from you all. So let me begin by first introducing Dr. Renee Wegrezen, who is the first ever director of ARPA-H. And she's going to give us a good description of what ARPA-H is. I won't even try to get through the acronym on all of that. And then we have Mohit Manrao, who is the Senior Vice President of Oncology for AstraZeneca in the United States. And we have then Jeffrey Aronin, who is, in addition to, like me, being a member of the Board of Trustees of the Aspen Institute, is the Chairman and CEO of Paragon Biosciences, and is a renowned investor and entrepreneur in the field of neurology in the biopharmaceutical industry. So that's the incredible group that we have together today. So thank you all for being with us and for participating at the Aspen Institute's health event. So let's start off with Renee. So Renee, ARPA-H is probably the hottest commodity out there. I mean, in healthcare, it's talked about so much, it's new, it's fancy and everything. A lot of times people will compare it to DARPA and say, well, ARPA-H is just HHS's version of DARPA. You do this a lot. You and I have been together where you've had to do this with me repeatedly. Can you give a bit of a recitation for everybody of what is ARPA-H? How does it work? How is it different than some of the things we think of like NIH or BARDA? If it's different from DARPA, where you used to be? Just could you give a bit of a tutorial for us? That would be great.
It's my favorite thing to talk about. And, you know, a year ago, I remember, Alex, we were here, and you heard me talk on a panel about ARPA-H, and you grabbed me afterwards and said I converted you on the panel. So it's actually
Do you want me to tell that story? So I actually opposed ARPA-H when it was originally proposed under President Trump, because the format was, it was proposed basically as, if you do this, you'll cure pancreatic cancer. And I was president of Eli Lilly in the United States. I knew that's not so easy. And it just was presented as quite facile. Renee then, I got to hear her talk over at Dor Hosier, I think it was, and I grabbed her and said, can we keep talking? Because the way you're talking about this is much more interesting. So sorry.
So that's a great lead up to, I think we still have the title of youngest government agency. This is our second year of existence, and it really is modeled after DARPA. So if you haven't heard of DARPA, certainly you've heard of the internet and stealth technology, and there's a little government agency that was part of the initial catalytic investment when those were just sort of an idea on the back of a napkin, but to really make those initial investments to demonstrate the art of what's possible at a convincing scale, that there can be a second funder and a third funder beyond that initial de-risking of those technologies. And so over time, there had been a lot of interest in creating an ARPA for health, but it wasn't until this administration that we were able to get it off the ground. Thanks a lot to Francis Collins here too, who convened a lot of folks about what about the DARPA model is really important to maintain, and what do we need to be very different. And so I was part of a group that talked about program managers. So for an ARPA to work, those ideas can't come top down. They have to come in a very organic way from brilliant people with ideas and big problems that they want to solve in health. It's term limited, so when we find these program managers, they come on for 3 years. So they attack these challenges with a sense of urgency. I remind them every 2 weeks that goes by, 1% of their time is up. So after one of our last meetings, they're like, I'm at 25%, I'm at 37%. But it really brings a sense of, like, we have a limited amount of time to solve these problems, and what are we going to demonstrate given the incredible levers that we have in the federal government. One major difference from DARPA is a successful DARPA program will get picked up by the Department of Defense. A successful ARPA-H program is not guaranteed to be funded by HHS or by a state. So we have to work very hard on transition to get things out into the ecosystem. So really excited to be here today as we spread the word about ARPA-H and our model and the promise of some of the technologies that you'll hear a bit more about today.
Well, thank you, and hopefully over the course of the next 50 minutes, you will understand how I was converted from a net demoter to a net promoter of ARPA-H through Dr. Wegrezen's great advocacy and leadership. So Jeff, wanted to talk for a second about the biopharmaceutical industry, because of course so much is the handoff from ARPA-H or NIH into industry. We have so much potential right now. We are really finally seeing the fruition of the path-breaking work of Dr. Francis Collins and our understanding of the human genome and the molecular nature of disease as the decades have now passed. We're seeing such productivity coming out of the biopharmaceutical industry, such incredible cures, yet the biopharmaceutical capital markets have been crushed for the last several years. Yep. Do you agree with my statement, and what's going on, and what do you see happening there?
It's exactly right. It has been, the last several decades have been remarkable as far as innovation, advancements. I mean, just in my career, we've watched us go from small molecule to large molecule to monoclonal antibodies, RNAi, to now utilizing the information from the genome. Thank you, Dr. Collins. We have made such advancements. Diseases that we had to do surgeries for, had no treatments, now have treatments. It's been an incredible time, and the markets were very good. Recently, it's been a short period, but it has been a very difficult time in these markets because a few factors. One, there's many. It's, when you invest in biotech drug development, because it's such a long time frame, and it's so hard. It is, and there's needs and things are changing. Interest rates have a big impact. So as interest rates change, cost of capital went up. So now you have all these periods, these long periods, that the investing community starts to say, well, we got to make sure we have capital to get these companies all the way through. So now these earlier ones are challenging. And that's a piece of it. Some other changes, the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, Big Pharma said, okay, we're now not going to, we're more interested in drugs that may be just underneath the biggest markets, so that aren't managed. So now suddenly rare disease drugs, areas that were less attractive, now look a little more attractive because they're under that threshold. So just government regulation, payers now have more tools available to them. It's much more surgical than it used to be as they think about. So all those factors have come into play.
So that's actually an interesting transition. So you're seeing in the biopharmaceutical venture startup entrepreneurial world more of a focus on end game commercialization potential, the total addressable market, payer restrictions, et cetera, because historically, it's really just been probability of technical success. We'll worry about that later. You're seeing a bit of a more of a transition in the biotech world?
Yes. You're trying to not only know what's going to be available, other treatments are being developed, some much faster than the traditional technology allowed you to do, but you're also thinking about how big the market is, how payers are thinking about it, and the probability of success, because as you know, the developing medicine is, the odds are against you. Science is very complex, and we still, even with all these discoveries, we don't really understand the human body, biology, the way we do certain other areas.
Yeah. Well, Mohit, AstraZeneca's strategy is to end cancer as a cause of death. That's quite a noble ambition. How will you make that happen? What's the strategy? And I'm going to give you a chance also. You winced whenever I made my statement summarizing that it was more about PTS than commercialization. Feel free to hit back on that also.
Yeah, I want to add on that. But like starting with, I'll also want you to convert on we can cure pancreatic cancer one day. We'll get there. I think if you think about that bold ambition you talked about, eliminating cancer as a cause of death, I believe that's going to be an evergreen mission in many ways, but we have milestones to hit to get to that 5-year survival, 10-year survival, living with cancer as a chronic disease, and that is starting to become reality in some tumor types. What our approach in that is to invest in cutting-edge technologies across. And firstly, foremost is having multiple approaches on dealing with cancer. So either fighting cancer cells or killing cancer cells directly through approaches like ADCs, antibody drug conjugates, radiopharmaceuticals, tumor driver of resistance, DNA damage response, epigenetics. So we are developing
I hope you all understand all of that.
whole array, of, Francis gets it, a whole array of scientific approaches in that. And on the other side is really harnessing the immune system. How can we train our bodies and our cells to be able to attack it? And we've built and invested across those modalities to be able to unlock the potential to kind of get deeper and durable responses and treat cancer earlier is our second approach, to really start to identify cancer early and intervene for a specific patient at a specific time for a limited time-bound approaches so that they can continue with their lives and we can have monitoring going on. So that's our second approach in our strategy to go early with early cancer detection and treatment. And the last is to really ensure that this all comes alongside with precision medicine. It is to really identify who would benefit from what approach, and really starting to get narrower and narrower to a population which is individualized and precision approaches. And all of this at a scale where we are looking at not only one geography, et cetera, but across the world to be able to do that. So that's our strategy from an oncology perspective. But to your point on, we are making investments across these, from modalities to investing at grassroots level and investing in systems and investing in early screening and partnering alongside many of the ecosystem partners on this.
So it sounds as if what you're doing at AstraZeneca is really building internal platform capabilities across the cancer space in a way that, for internal discovery and development, in a way that's somewhat contrary to sometimes the impression people have that Big Pharma really just buys innovation elsewhere as opposed to generates it internally.
So I think that yes, and we are following the science, and you know, it's important to be clear that you cannot do it all alone. And there may be better technologies out there where you want to partner or bring them in. For example, in cell therapy, we have had our own program, but we've also found some new technologies that have been developed, and we haven't shied away from bringing them in and integrating and accelerating our platform. So it's a balance of both, but truly looking at following the science and uncovering what biology is teaching us, both internally, but also not shying away from bringing. And coming back to what you were asking, Jeff, I think at the end of the day, it's important that we are in the, from a healthcare business perspective, we are in the business of really trying to create value by identifying modalities that can help solve for diseases, but also being able to capture that value to bring back and invest in innovation. And the challenge is when there is uncertainty on how much you can capture back and invest back, that's when biotech starts struggling. That's when big pharma also has to make decisions on where to go and what to do, because the uncertainty is now more, and there's less value of innovation to be captured later.
Exactly. Well, Renee, when I was secretary, Dr. Collins used to come in and we would have regular sessions of what he called cool science. Give us some cool science. What are you most excited about in your innovation and investment portfolio right now? What are you seeing that just has you like, oh, I cannot believe that this could be possible?
Yeah, it's pretty exciting because I wouldn't have dreamed of half of these programs. It's finding these program managers. And so one of my favorite ones to talk about is a program called Thea. So Thea was the goddess of sight. And one of our program managers has launched a program to do whole eye transplantation. And so this is everything from preserving the tissue to reconnecting the optic nerve to then actually having your brain understand the signals. And so these are the types of challenges that we really are tackling at ARPA-H that couldn't be done elsewhere. It's too risky for the private sector. It's a little bit too ultra-focused and aggressive in the timelines for something like NIH, but we collaborate really well across those areas. Maybe a couple of others just to give you a scope, because we are disease agnostic and technology agnostic. So our snapshot of ARPA-H today is going to be different 5 years from now. We have an effort called Paradigm, and this was launched by an emergency room doc who spent the pandemic on a retrofit Winnebago and said, we can do better. And so he's designing the mobile health unit of the future that will bring hospital-level care to rural settings. And so this is, think all the imaging deserts that are around the country. What's that ruggedized CT scan innovation that you can bring forward? But importantly, also integrating something like AI-assisted task guidance. So you could have a community health worker who may not have hospital-level skills, but to be guided through the tasks when engaging with a patient in those rural settings. So those are just two examples. We have about 25, 26 projects announced. Maybe this will be a good time to cue a slide that we have that you guys can go check out the website if you're looking to learn more about the projects we are already investing in, but also how to work with us, how to bring your ideas to reality at ARPA-H.
Great. So we've got the slide up there with QR codes that either now or afterwards, feel free to do that to get more information about ARPA-H and how to apply at ARPA-H. Jeff, back to you. And you touched on this a little bit, but it's so important because we are about those critical investments that have to happen, and your world is where it all starts. Where are you seeing capital going in the biopharmaceutical world right now? Why is it going there, and what's getting left behind? What should we be worried about that isn't happening?
The big picture, the areas that we're seeing are CNS, in great part because we have challenges that are, we don't have a choice. So Alzheimer's, is going to ultimately bankrupt our system if we don't figure out how to treat this. The cost they predict will be over $1 trillion by 2050. So CNS, the other reason for CNS is it's hard. The brain is very complicated, and we didn't understand it. We didn't have the diagnostic tools to understand it. We didn't have the computational power to understand what we were finding. So we have now made so many breakthroughs in this area. So CNS is one where capital is going, and we're finding a lot of progress there. The other area you just touched on was immunology, utilizing the body's power and to treat across many areas, whether it's neuroimmunology or in oncology. So that's an area where we're seeing a lot more capital go and a lot more success. Mm-hmm. So those are the big areas. And I think, given the changes of the market, I think some categories that have multiple options are now, and there's massive need. It's not like they don't have need in these areas, but because there's options available, you're seeing less investment go into those areas. Like cardiovascular.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How about mental health? We haven't really seen, I don't think, we haven't seen many new launches in serious mental health lately. I mean, it's been quite some time, I think. Are you seeing good work out there and innovation that gets you excited?
It's a complicated area. Psychiatry in general is hard. There are companies doing more and more in there, but it's not an area we're seeing near enough innovation or investment. You are now seeing, but it's still not mainstream, but more of the psychedelic drugs being used in mental health. There's promise, but it's still complex.
I guess one of the challenges is the lack of firm endpoints so often in mental health. You end up with such a massive potential placebo effect. Those trials are so difficult. I mean, I dealt with that for a long time.
In psych, they often have to run 3, 4, 5 trials, and these are multi-billion-dollar trials.
Yeah. So Mohit, Jeff talked a bit about the massive investments that have to be made, really on a binary event of success or failure on clinical trials that are completely unknowable in advance. I've often joked that the pharmaceutical industry is the riskiest business on earth, run by the most risk-averse people on earth, because what they have to do is manage that risk. They've got to sort of how do you de-risk your investment profile? There's a new risk on the horizon that adds, as you talked about earlier, uncertainty in the equation. The Inflation Reduction Act and drug price negotiation. How does AstraZeneca, how do you think about the IRA and impacting those massive investments that need to get made to take innovation from NIH, innovation from biopharmaceutical industry, innovation from ARPA-H, those next $1 billion down the road to hit the market?
Yeah, I mean, Inflation Reduction Act has clearly a few good parts about out-of-pocket, cap on seniors and also smoothing and many other things which are great. The risk we have is this Inflation Reduction Act becoming an Innovation Reduction Act because of the unintended consequences that were not the original intent maybe that were built in. And I'll share an example. If you think of innovation in orphan diseases. And an Orphan Drug Act 4 decades ago like put in incentives for those orphan diseases to be targeted by biotechs, by pharmaceutical companies, to really start looking at what could be brought in. And there were 600 plus medicines approved for 1,000, kind of indications and treatments. But there are still 7,000 of those which don't have a treatment option. Now, what Orphan Drug Act clauses in the IRA say is, if you have one orphan designation, it's fine. Even if you don't have an approval and you have another designation, you will not be exempt from negotiation. So what does that mean is, as the life cycle that Jeff was talking about, that it is downstream that you see the benefit. It takes years and years to develop that. Suddenly you're sitting with an uncertainty that if I go for this, science tells me I may be successful, my technical success is 30%, but at the end of it, the price, I don't know what it was going to be like, and I'm going to be actually penalized on the indication that I have also. You have a different conversation. Not that you won't follow science. What will happen is it will compete with an equivalent opportunity, which has more certainty. You would still follow the science, you will still put patient at the heart of it, but this is what it will start playing. A drug and a class that we work in is PARP. One of our drugs, Lynparza, was approved in 2014 here in the US for late-line ovarian cancer. Roughly 300 women would benefit at that point in time. Later, it got earlier into the lines and got into breast cancer, pancreatic cancer, prostate cancer. If IRA was there, the conversations would be, do you invest this $300 million into a second orphan disease, pancreatic cancer, where you know the odds are so difficult to succeed and the technical success is maybe less than 10%, or you would put this investment in a different place? Or actually, would you go after breast cancer when we know it won't work? It would take 8 years for the trial to read out, when actually this will be disincentive for your true population. So those are the nuances that are getting lost in terms of innovation meeting the market. And I think that's where we got to work together on, rather than complaining about these, on solutions that can be actually course correct this and come to the original intent. And there are things pending in the Congress and the Senate in terms of an Orphan Cures Act and a bipartisan effort to drive things there. So I think there's more we all can do together to recognize that there are certain good elements and there's innovation that will struggle. There's a report out there that talks about 139 less treatments would be coming to market in 10 years because of these things. Who knows what the number would be? But yes, those conversations are happening in boardrooms because of competing investment priorities given the pool of investments you have.
Thank you. So, Renee, you have been warping at, let's coin a phrase, warp speed at getting money out and projects funded. One of the things people, at least in casual conversation, have talked about or noted is that a lot of the funding has been going to universities or at least have university partners as part of it. And some in the biopharmaceutical, some in the device world have expressed a concern, is there an over-indexing towards academia that might hinder that translation into private sector capital investment for the kind of development needed to bring across the finish line? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah.
And I don't know if I'm wrong, myth bust for us?
Yeah, right. So we do have a lot of investment outside of universities, but it's true. We've been funding projects for about a year. And what we saw as the applications started to come in the first 6 months, it was sort of the universities that knew how to apply for government funds, right? So no surprises there, but people chomping at the bit, just waiting for there to be a way to apply. But what we knew those folks would come, and what we've spent so much time on through our transition office is really reaching out to other parts of the ecosystem. So small companies, states that we wouldn't normally work with, and really just ask them, what are the barriers? Why aren't you working with the government on these projects? And so I think we do a pretty good job at listening and hearing insights. And I just want to give you an example. We recently launched a sprint for women's health to try to really cover this greatly underfunded area across 6 health topics that our program managers have brought forward. There's a lot of small companies innovating in this area. It's a really tough market, as you noted. And so we said, what would it take to get you to work with us? And they said, well, we can't give one person to write a grant because that's maybe, we might only have 5 people, but we pitch really well to VCs. And we said, well, let's just enter that work stream. So using our incredible authorities that we have, thank you, Congress, we did a process where we have a 3-page white paper. And if we're excited about that project, we invite the proposers to pitch for 30 minutes, and we will make a funding decision based on that. And so very overwhelming applications. It took a little while to get through them, but I'm really pleased to say that 42% of those applications were businesses with less than 10 people. And that is unheard of in the federal government. And so like these levers, I think that we are going to be changing those stats because we really are trying to be intentional to bring in more of those non-traditional players to ARPA-H.
So that's the funding side. How are you thinking about commercialization? So you get there, that next stage, and I guess I'll then ask Mohit and Jeff if you could follow up on what do you need from ARPA-H to make that a successful transition to capital investment?
So there's a lot of us that have spent time. I spent time as an executive in biotech. There's quite a few of us that really want to work better with government. And so some of the things we've done is we actually don't issue grants. We only issue contracts, cooperative agreements, and something called other transactions, which means that we can have, it's something else, and it's bespoke. We work with companies, and we negotiate the IP. It's the OTs, as we call them, are exempt from buy-dole, so there's no march-in rights from the federal government. We can then negotiate the IP and the terms that really work for the federal government and for the private sector. But importantly, when we have VC advisors that actually work with our program managers. So as we launch programs, not only do we make sure that there aren't other places in the federal government that are funding these topics, but we ask, what would, if we could de-risk, that you would then pick up and fund. So if somebody comes to a VC and they come back to me when you've demonstrated X, like we want to fund X.
Great. Gentlemen?
It's great what they're doing. It's great. It's so important what's being done at teaching institutions, what's being done by the federal government in these, to advance these therapies, because it is so, the human body is so complex. To advance some of these, we just wouldn't see it. And, people are often surprised. Only 50 drugs a year get approved. 50 new full drug applications. And so, $23 billion was invested. It's a hard business, but this type of work, the further they can take it, they call it the valley of death. The further you can take it, the better it is for us to then take it through those risky periods. Because most of the cost, it's a very difficult industry in that what other industry has cost over the last 50 years gone up and takes longer? Usually you're seeing, all these, everything goes down. This has gotten more expensive, and technology is allowing this to get better, and I see a promising future. But the further they can take it, drug companies, biotech innovation can then take it to the next level.
Yeah, and I think, Renee, as you started sharing, the powers that ARPA-H has are unique. And I think that combined with thinking from the word get-go of what would be needed on a market level for this to be adopted, whether it is IP rights, whether it is risk management, whether it is regulatory framework change, reimbursement changes. I think from the get-go of a little bit of a thought process on that, along with the powers you have in terms of helping shape that, is going to be the magic in that recipe of being able to scale. So the scale thinking from the beginning is what I'll say we'll need, because when people like Jeff or other pharmaceuticals would come in, they'll see, okay, how can we take it to masses? And if the market is saying, yeah, this is a great eye surgery, but there's no equipment, there's no, no sites, and there is no reimbursement, like, okay, it's going to be another 5 years to capture the value. How do we get it? So I think that scale element from the beginning and the way to shape it is the real power you guys have.
I love what you're saying there, because it's such an uncomfortable space for our program managers sometimes that we basically try to tear apart their programs before they even launch, because we want to look 5-10 years from now to see what's going to break. And I'll just give you one really great example of a very unique convening that ARPA-H can have, which is our first program, Nitro, was an osteoarthritis program. And it's needle-based injection of engineered bone and cartilage to be able to restore joints. So you don't have to have knee transplants or implants later. sector. And what we realized during the development of that program, talking with the marketplace, was FDA had not agreed upon a large animal model for that. And so even before we funded efforts, the program manager reached out to FDA and we said, let's work together. We need you to agree on an animal model within the first year of our program so that we can continue the pace that we're moving. And that's a benefit to ARPA-H, but it's a benefit to that entire sector, even those that we don't fund. And so we've now had several convenings and are working towards finalizing that animal model, which then kind of paves the way for innovation in those places. And so we want to continue to do that with our partners across federal government as well.
What a great transition to the next question I was going to ask. Jeff and Mohit, we've talked about the front end and your advice. Back end, FDA, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you fix or change at FDA that makes that last mile workable?
Yeah, I think Renee has a little bit of a magic wand I need to borrow sometime. I mean, like taking a lens of cancer again, and we talk about eliminating it as a cause of death, curing cancer, you will see that trials are starting to become longer and bigger and with smaller identified patient population. We need novel new endpoints. We can't wait for 10 years for the standard endpoints to show up for helping those women or men or the population that we are trying to address those treatments with. So I think if we can work together on identifying surrogate endpoints that help us bring science to practice faster, technology to transform care faster, that would be the magic wand if we can work across with FDA and other stakeholders to do that.
You know, it's interesting, and there are others in the room who would have much more history on this, but Donna Shalala and I teach a class together, and we had David Kessler, her FDA commissioner, down a couple weekends ago at University of Miami, and he was telling the story of how the dynamic around HIV/AIDS research dramatically changed in the 90s, and it was forcing a change in the endpoint.
Exactly.
Instead of survival, moving to surrogate endpoints, because the trials were taking forever if you had to wait to see about survivability. So yeah, so critical.
Yeah, and that's going to become the need of the hour with all that we are trying to deal with. So I think the more we can do together on that. And Jeff, you want to add?
I mean, look, the FDA is still the best in the world. And
You still think that? You'd still put it up against the European?
well, look, all of our drugs, we end up going to now it's gotten closer, but you know, whether it's Japan, EMU, you know, we work with them all. The FDA is still the best in the world, based on evidence, based on science, based on regulatory rules. That is very important. We don't want to lose that. But innovation happens. We have to be more flexible. Real world evidence. We can, there's a lot of things we can change as you look at just, it doesn't have to be based on how it was based in the past. It's how are we going to do it in the future? And part of it to be fully staffed FDA with trained people in all these new areas. Because if we're not trained in CRISPR and genomic, I mean, there are some things we're seeing, as you just talked about, that are so new and novel. There's very few people that even understand what's being done. So you need your FDA to be prepared for that, to advance those.
Thank you very much. Well, listen, we have got such a great audience here and such a full house. I want to make sure we have time for you all to ask questions. So let's transition now to that. And we've got some microphones. And Mr. Louder, would you care to kick us off?
Thanks. My question is about the Biden administration's proposed march-in rights under Bayh-Dole. They are proposing that under the Bayh-Dole Act, there is the ability for the government to march in and take the intellectual property, give it and license it to another drug maker if the federal government has provided any funding anywhere in the past. And so if you could comment on how that would affect your decisions regarding future investments and whether you think it might even ever be effective at reducing drug prices.
Listen, drug pricing is a important, critical issue. We need to get medicine to people who need it, and that is very important. But intellectual property is the key. There is no drug industry, there is no innovation, there's nothing without intellectual property and patents. It wouldn't exist, it couldn't exist. We're talking about as long as it takes, as much capital, and to not have certainty on intellectual property, patents going into drug development, it wouldn't happen. That's very challenging. The work the government does to innovate and help with that capital is important, and America benefits from that. As Germany used to be the breadbasket of drug innovation. Now it's America, and America benefits from that in many ways. But that is dangerous. It is innovation is so important, and there won't be innovation without intellectual property.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think there are two elements you touched on. Drug pricing, it's a complex topic, but one everybody would agree is out of pocket for a patient should not make them make choices of I would get on a treatment or not. We have to solve for it. For a commercial plans, pharmaceuticals and others have been able to support, and there has been always an ask to support Medicare, and now with the caps that's helping. But it's complicated in terms of the value chain that we have and who captures the intermediaries, et cetera, and we can spend hours on that. But on the innovation side, I think free markets drive better access and better innovation from that perspective, and protecting that IP is really critical. March in orders was just going to create more uncertainty around what investments were there, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, I would also ask for us to all go back on how much government funding and how much other private funding and the risk that carries over the time period is managed in that. So I don't think the topic is that easy, but at the same time, these are two different nuances. March in orders doesn't solve for drug pricing challenges that still exist with the intermediaries that kind of take away the value rather than putting it back in the investment value chain.
And the interesting thing, Gary, is so often when we're talking about policy choices, the thoughts about what could happen are theoretical. We've been there and done that, though, before with this. In the 90s, there was an effort to use buy-dole margin rights based on price. It was thought about, it was talked about, and the capital investment in biopharmaceutical out of NIH-generated intellectual property dried up. And the administration walked that back and said, no, that's a mistake. We need this investment because we have to translate the great insights and primary research happening at NIH into commercialization, otherwise they'll sit on the shelf. So this is at least one where we know what will happen. We've seen it before. We've been to the rodeo before.
Maybe I'll offer just like a little of a
Please.
different perspective. I won't address buy-dole specifically, but because we have the ability to be so flexible in our contracting, I think this ARPA-H is an opportunity to be super creative in that space too. So not just the technology. In this Nitro program for osteoarthritis, we did an experiment, and we haven't been super public about it because we don't know how the experiment ended yet. But the terms that we put in place, we absolutely believe the companies need to own the IP. But we have created a term that, if successful, this is very risky, there's a chance it won't be successful, but if successful, that we will pre-negotiate a price at cost to purchase in bulk the cellular therapy so that we can get it to patients that are underserved. And so it's time bound, so it's a 10-year time bound. And so this is a way to make sure that it's not just those that can afford it can get there first. And so I do think that's a lot of the intent of what buy-dole was trying to accomplish. And so we are trying to do some experiments to see are there other ways that we can address this, that it's still a win-win for everybody.
Thank you. And now we've got a question in the back there with a microphone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. When we look at new cancer immunotherapy drugs, there's definitely a lot of responder, non-responder. But one thing that's becoming apparent is the role of the gut microbiome in potentiating, responders versus non-responders. And some of the best work being done is actually at NB Anderson through Jennifer Wargo. And the one thing that I think is interesting is that, when you look at cohorts, the cohort that had higher fiber consumption shifted their microbiome into a way that increased essentially response. Have you thought about adding very inexpensive arms, such that you'd have a prebiotic fiber intervention rather than maybe spending millions of dollars to try and go down to the nth degree from molecular targeting when we know that this is a very strong signal, again, from an RWE perspective. And I think this dovetails with the food as medicine movement that obviously is getting, White House support. So I'm curious, how are you thinking about food as medicine pairing with a therapeutic to increase, responder rates?
Anyone have?
Well, I mean, I can I mean, my researchers are not in the room to say what the data is, but I think it's important to follow the science, and combining therapeutics with that improves the therapeutic index for interventions is critical. I would also say on immunotherapies, they have been transformative, but we have to accept that only 3 in 10 respond, which means like the 70% are not, and we got to do better for them, either by improving response rates through approaches like this or other approaches, but also by really also trying to understand who won't, so that we don't give them those therapies. So I mean, I believe that's at the forefront of precision medicine, and techniques like this or research that's there. I'll ensure that I get it shared back with our researchers to explore what's possible with that. I don't know if you want to add, Jeff.
Controlling all the factors when you do a clinical trial is really important, and we're getting more sophisticated at doing that.
Next question. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah.
Yep.
I have a question about capital efficiency and effectiveness. For about 8 years, I've been an angel investor in women-led startups, and mostly in the area of women health, whether it's biopharmaceuticals, devices, diagnostics, information technology. And I'm wondering just how effective, because these are all like small companies, 4 or 5 people trying to get started. And after years and years, a lot of them have failed. But what I see most is that they spend most of the time raising capital as opposed to trying to do the research and the development, and it just stretches out the development time. So is angel investing a really good way to go for these things as opposed to institutional or government? And then do you see many companies that started off as angel investments coming your way?
Thank you. Jeff, do you want to start, and then Renee?
A lot of the early capital for many companies starts out with angel investors. It is the challenge, I think, as you've identified, is it is a very complex industry. It is with so many factors, because you need a small biotech needs all the same divisions that AstraZeneca does. You need to have a regulatory expert, a clinical expert. You need to have people thinking about a statistician, all these pieces. That's often the challenge. And you're right, raising capital alongside doing that. These small companies it's very challenging. But that's why those companies often lead to becoming the big companies.
Renee?
Yeah, so from our side, we have seen quite a few small companies, and one of the innovations that we've tried to pursue through this, our ARPA-H Health Innovation Network, are all those factors that are required to make a small company successful, to provide access to all of our teams equally. So for example, if you need to manufacture something as one of your products, we can help negotiate from a government perspective a good rate with a vendor to provide that, not just for maybe one small company, but for all the small companies we fund under a given program. This is an advantage to the government because we pre-negotiate a good rate. It's good for the vendor because we give them, bulk access to these performers. So we're trying to create some of those inroads that could be attractive. And for our Women's Health Sprint, we have $3 million or $10 million awards, so they're significant. They're non-dilutive, so that tends to be favorable to venture. And we also provide an expert in residence. And so as they develop their business plans and the regulatory plans, we pair them with a partner who is not from the federal government, importantly, to help them kind of get ready to pitch for that next fundraise.
Terrific. And next question there, please.
My name is Kathy Kenworthy. Thank you so much for being here today. Great panel. I'm curious, consider this like a little bit of an anti-innovation question, but there was a famous study done, ironically, 10 years ago that said it takes 17 years for any given improvement to standard of care to go from, it being identified to actually common points of care. Are there investments and opportunities that you think should be focused on, lifted up, that really is more about the things we already know, reaching the people that those innovations can help?
Anyone?
I mean, I can start. So I think there are 2 things. I fully agree with you, Kathy, that we just came back from ASCO, and we had some great data presented. And people ask me like, hey, why do you need an organization? This is phenomenal practice will change. It doesn't change. There are so many barriers to, in the system that needs to be addressed for everybody to get an equivalent standard of care. Disparities in care exist. So there's absolutely concentrated effort to ensure what we already have today, we can bring it to every zip code and every, irrespective of their socioeconomic determinants of health, we can really serve all patients. So that's one part. But also I think there's an other important part where technology could be enabler is to shrink that process of 17 years as one part. So for example, we are deploying AI very early in discovery phase to understand what are the right targets, right? And then being able to screen our small molecules through that, which took 3 months to in 3 weeks. Then to really test and actually recruit clinical trials using data on where do we find diverse patients in the EMRs, et cetera. Because the challenge we have is we think of equity after everything has come through. We have to start thinking of it from the beginning. So again, solving for that from the upfront, while reducing that 17 years to hopefully less than 7 years, and then within that, being able to solve for barriers that generally are then looked upon later of delivery aspects, are the keys to solve for it. But I fully agree, there's so much that's already in hand that we can help improve care at a zip code level versus constantly driving innovation. Thank you.
We've got Claire in the third row here, and then if we could, and then we'll have Dr. Collins will finish us off. Oh yeah, no.
Hi, how you doing? Thanks for a great talk. I'd like to understand what you're doing to try to improve screening in, for example, prostate cancer. We know it's the leading cause of cancer-related deaths amongst men worldwide, particularly in black men. What are you doing in terms of a screening approach to tackle that, particular group of people, for example? And as you know, prevention is better than cure. So what are you doing exactly, just like to try to improve that?
Yeah, sure, and please chime in. So we had a morning breakfast discussion, and this again came up that there is such an unmet need, and I shared a couple of examples. If you take lung cancer as an example, approved screening for high-risk patients, 50 plus with a smoking history, 6% is the national uptake. It is dismal, and there are so many barriers from stigma to access to cultural nuances, etc. You cannot solve it at a national level. So I'm taking a lung cancer example, a couple of initiatives that we have done, and we cannot do it alone, and that's important. So we've partnered with ACCC for rural ablation using data to look at pollution rates, incidence rates, mortality rates, identified counties where there are those challenges. Then worked with local ambassadors who are the local face to being able to bring screening to them versus them to screening, right? So solving challenges and barriers and understanding them at zip code level and solving them with local communities is the key. Similarly, in breast cancer, mammography has come to a certain level. But if you look at among African-American women, it's still trailing back. So again, working with them on solving solutions. The answer is that we need to work with local communities at local level to understand what are the different barriers of different communities and then have tailored solution. That's what I have kind of seen across, irrespective of prostate, breast, lung, colorectal, or cervical.
The front end, as you point out, is very complex, and there's a lot of things we can be doing. In addition, the data now that we have compute, finally, that can take this data and give us information to get better treatments, to get the information we need to treat people better, to get treatments and cures, we have to make that information available, or data available and shared. So a university should be sharing it with another university. We should have all these different communities that hold data in a blinded way, sharing it so that we can create the information we need.
Alex, in the morning you used the forum to do a commercial message for this. I want to do a PSA. Like you asked a great question. Mm-hmm. We all are ambassadors in our communities. Can we please take up an action of going and talking to at least 1 or 2 people in our network who are eligible for screening today and motivate them and encourage them to talk to their healthcare practitioner? It will go a long way. And it's easy, for this room understands many of these challenges and nuances, so let's be ambassadors for our people and our communities. So.
Amen. Thank you. Dr. Collins?
So this has been a terrific panel, and thank you for really documenting the way in which the American ecosystem is alive and well in terms of the connection between academic researchers, small companies, large companies, advocates, the regulatory system, which we all love to beat up on, but which, as you've said, is probably the best in the world. But maybe we could just, before we close up, think about the rest of the world. And particularly, when you think of the demographics of where our world is going in the next decade or so, I think something like 40% of the people under age 30 by 10 years from now will be living in sub-Saharan Africa. Enormous talent base there, enormous labor opportunity, but are we going to be in a place where that is able to be capitalized and built upon to give fantastic jobs and opportunities, or are we just going to stir up more and more dissension and conflict between the well-off nations and those that are not? You all are in a place where I think everybody would agree some of the greatest opportunities for economic development occur in health. How much does this get talked about when we're really trying to think about the longer horizon, 10 or 20 years from now? Are we in a place where some of these amazing developments don't just have to happen in the countries that have all the resources?
I'll just start by what we have seen historically is you can look at India and China. And today I can go to a lab in Hyderabad and it looks exactly the same as labs in Boston and New Jersey. And the education they got when they came to the US, at first a lot of the students stayed. Now many go back and they're innovating, and that's becoming a prosperous biotech, pharma area. And you're seeing the same thing with China. Used to just be able to do active pharmaceutical ingredient. Now they're doing very complex science.
Mohit, would you finish with one quick?
Yeah, so Dr. Collins, great comment. And I think it's really critical that we look at it in two parts. One is tapping into that emerging geographies from a research and science perspective, and thus giving them an equal platform to learn about clinical trials, infrastructure, running those. But more importantly, on the delivery side, there's a huge gap in terms of the care that they get and the standard of care that exists in those countries or approved versus where we are. So the more we move forward, the more they will go back because the standard of care comparators are wrong. So I think there is huge effort to be done in that. And as I said at the beginning, our strategy includes being a part of and ensuring that it's a geographical presence across and it's not focused on one market, but you make a very fair point.
And Mohit is being modest in not claiming credit for all AstraZeneca did on the COVID vaccine around the world. Yeah. So they were a huge player outside the US in what they did, so thank you for that. Yeah. Listen, please, thank you. Please join me in thanking this incredible panel, and thank you all for being here. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Alex. Thank you.